Number 1 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. Number 1, Balthazar, by Anatole France.
Chapter 1. In those days Balthazar, whom the Greeks called Saracen, reigned in Ethiopia. He was black, but comely of countenance. He had a simple soul and a generous heart. The 3rd year of his reign, which was the 22nd of his age, he left his dominions on a visit to Balkis, Queen of Sheba. The mage Sembobitis and the eunuch Menkera accompanied him. He had in his train 75 camels bearing cinnamon, myrrh, gold dust, and elephants' tusks. As they rode, Sembobitis instructed him in the influences of the planets, as well as in the virtues of precious stones, and Menkera sang him canticles from the sacred mysteries. He paid but little heed to them, but amused himself instead watching the jackals with their ears pricked up, sitting erect on the edge of the desert. At last, after a march of 12 days, Balthazar became conscious of the fragrance of roses, and very soon they saw the gardens that surround the city of Sheba. On their way they passed young girls dancing under pomegranate trees in full bloom. "The dance," said Sembobitis the mage, "is a prayer." "One could sell these women for a great price," said Menkera the eunuch. As they entered the city they were amazed at the extent of the sheds and warehouses and workshops that lay before them, and also at the immense quantities of merchandise with which these were piled. For a long time they walked through the streets thronged with chariots, street porters, donkeys, and donkey drivers, until all at once the marble walls, the purple awnings, and the gold cupolas of the palace of Balkis lay spread out before them. The Queen of Sheba received them in a courtyard cooled by jets of perfumed water, which fell with a tinkling cadence like a shower of pearls. Smiling, she stood before them in a jeweled robe. At sight of her, Balthazar was greatly troubled. She seemed to him lovelier than a dream, and more beautiful than desire. "My lord," and Sembobitis spoke under his breath, "remember to conclude a good commercial treaty with the Queen." "Have a care, my lord," Menkera added. "It is said she employs magic with which to gain the love of men." Then, having prostrated themselves, the mage and the eunuch retired. Balthazar, left alone with Balkis, tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but he could not utter a word. He said to himself, "The Queen will be angered at my silence." But the Queen still smiled and looked not at all angry. She was the first to speak with a voice sweeter than the sweetest music. "Be welcome, and sit down at my side." And with a slender finger, like a ray of white light, she pointed to the purple cushions on the ground. Balthazar sat down, gave a great sigh, and grasping a cushion in each hand, he cried hastily, "Madam, I would these 2 cushions were 2 giants, your enemies. I would wring their necks." And as he spoke he clutched the cushions with such violence in his hands that the delicate stuff cracked, and out flew a cloud of snow-white down. One of the tiny feathers swayed a moment in the air, and then alighted on the bosom of the Queen. "My lord Balthazar," Balkis said, blushing, "why do you wish to kill giants?" "Because I love you," said Balthazar. "Tell me," Balkis asked, "is the water good in the wells of your capital?" "Yes," Balthazar replied in some surprise. "I am curious to know," Balkis continued, "how a dry conserve of fruit is made in Ethiopia." The King did not know what to answer. "Now please tell me, please," she urged. Whereupon, with a mighty effort of memory, he tried to describe how Ethiopian cooks preserve quinces in honey. But she did not listen, and suddenly she interrupted him. "My lord, it is said that you love your neighbor, Queen Candace. Is she more beautiful than I am? Do not deceive me." "More beautiful than you, madam?" Balthazar cried as he fell at the feet of Balkis. "How could that possibly be?" "Well, then, her eyes, her mouth, "Her color? Her throat?" the queen continued. With his arms outstretched towards her, Balthazar cried, "Give me but the little feather that has fallen on your neck, and in return you shall have half my kingdom, as well as the wise Sembobitis and Menkera the eunuch." But she rose and fled with a ripple of dear laughter. When the mage and the eunuch returned, they found their master plunged deep in thought, which was not his custom. "My lord," asked Sembobitis, "have you concluded a good commercial treaty?" That day Balthazar supped with the Queen of Sheba, and drank the wine of the palm tree. "It is true, then," said Balkis, as they supped together, "that Queen Candace is not as beautiful as I." "Queen Candace is black," replied Balthazar. Balkis looked expressively at Balthazar. "One may be black and yet not ill-looking," she said. "Balkis!" cried the king. He said no more, but seized her in his arms, and the head of the queen sank back under the pressure of his lips. But he saw that she was weeping. Thereupon he spoke to her in the low, caressing tones that nurses use to their nurslings. He called her his little blossom and his little star. "Why do you weep?" he asked, "and what must one do to dry your tears? If you have a desire, tell me, and it shall be fulfilled." She ceased weeping, but she was sunk deep in thought. He implored her a long time to tell him her desire, and at last she spoke. "I wish to know fear." And as Balthazar did not seem to understand, she explained to him that for a long time past she had greatly longed to face some unknown danger, but she could not, for the men and gods of Sheba watched over her. "And yet," she added with a sigh, "during the night I long to feel the delicious chill of terror penetrate my flesh, to have my hair stand up on my head with horror. Oh, it would be such joy to be afraid!" She twined her arms about the neck of the dusky king, and said with the voice of a pleading child, "Night has come. Let us go through the town in disguise. Are you willing?" He agreed. She ran to the window at once and looked through the lattice into the square below. "A beggar is lying against the palace wall. Give him your garments and ask him in exchange for his camel hair turban and the coarse cloth girt about his loins. Be quick, and I will dress myself." And she ran out of the banqueting hall joyfully, clapping her hands one against the other. Balthazar took off his linen tunic, embroidered with gold, and girded himself with the skirt of the beggar. It gave him the look of a real slave. The queen soon reappeared, dressed in the blue seamless garment of the women who work in the fields. "Come," she said, and she dragged Balthazar along the narrow corridors towards a little door which opened on the fields. Chapter 2. The night was dark, and in the darkness of the night Balkis looked very small. She led Balthazar to one of the taverns where wastrels and street porters foregathered, along with prostitutes. The two sat down at a table, and saw through the foul air, by the light of a fetid lamp, unclean human brutes attack each other with fists and knives for a woman or a cup of fermented liquor, while others with clenched fists snored under the tables. The tavern keeper, lying on a pile of sacking, watched the drunken brawlers with a prudent eye. Balkis, having seen some salt fish hanging from the rafters of the ceiling, said to her companion, "I much wish to eat one of these fish with pounded onions." Balthazar gave the order. When she had eaten, he discovered that he had forgotten to bring money. It gave him no concern, for he thought that he could slip out with her without paying the reckoning. But the tavern keeper barred their way, calling them a vile slave and a worthless she-ass. Balthazar struck him to the ground with a blow of his fist. Whereupon some of the drinkers drew their knives and flung themselves on the two strangers. But the black man, seizing an enormous pestle used to pound Egyptian onions, knocked down two of his assailants and forced the others back. And all the while he was conscious of the warmth of Balkis' body as she cowered close against him. It was this which made him invincible. The tavern keeper's friends, not daring to approach again, flung at him from the end of the pot-house jars of oil, pewter vessels, burning lamps, and even the huge bronze cauldron in which a whole sheep was stewing. This cauldron fell with a horrible crash on Balthazar's head and split his skull. For a moment he stood as if dazed, and then summoning all his strength, he flung the cauldron back with such force that its weight was increased tenfold. The shock of the hurtling metal was mingled with indescribable roars and death rattles. Profiting by the terror of the survivors, and fearing that Balkis might be injured, he seized her in his arms and fled with her through the silence and darkness of the long, lonely byways. The stillness of night enveloped the earth, and the fugitives heard the clamor of the women and the carousers who pursued them at haphazard die away in the darkness. Soon they heard nothing more than the sound of dripping blood as it fell from the brow of Balthazar on the breast of Balkis. "I love you," the queen murmured. And by the light of the moon, as it emerged from behind a cloud, the king saw the white and liquid radiance of her half-closed eyes. They descended the dry bed of a stream, and suddenly Balthazar's foot slipped on the moss, and they fell together, locked in each other's embrace. They seemed to sink forever into a delicious void, and the world of the living ceased to exist for them. They were still plunged in the enchanting forgetfulness of time, space, and separate existence, when at daybreak the gazelles came to drink out of the hollows among the stones. At that moment a passing band of brigands discovered the two lovers lying on the moss. "They are poor," they said, "but we shall sell them for a great price, for they are so young and beautiful." Upon which they surrounded them, and having bound them, they tied them to the tail of an ass and proceeded on their way. The black man, so bound, threatened the brigands with death, but Balkis, who shivered in the cool, fresh air of the morning, only smiled, as if at something unseen. They tramped through frightful solitude until the heat of midday made itself felt. The sun was already high when the brigands unbound their prisoners, and letting them sit in the shade of a rock, threw them some mouldy bread which Balthazar disdained to touch, but which Balkis ate greedily. She laughed, and when the brigand chief asked why she laughed, she replied, "I laugh at the thought that I shall have you all hanged." "Indeed!" cried the chief. "A curious assertion in the mouth of a scullery wench like you, my love. Doubtless you will hang us all by aid of that blackamoor gallant of yours." At this insult Balthazar flew into a fearful rage, and he flung himself on the brigand and clutched his neck with such violence that he nearly strangled him. But the other drew his knife and plunged it into his body to the very hilt. The poor king rolled to earth, and as he turned on Balkis a dying glance, his sight faded. Chapter 3. At this moment was heard an uproar of men, horses, and weapons, and Balkis recognized her trusty Abner, who had come at the head of her guards to rescue his queen, of whose mysterious disappearance he had heard during the night. 3 times he prostrated himself at the feet of Balkis and ordered the litter to advance which had been prepared to receive her. In the meantime the guards bound the hands of the brigands. The queen turned towards the chief and said gently, "You cannot accuse me of having made you an idle promise, my friend, when I said you would be hanged." The mage Sembobitis and Menkera the eunuch, who stood beside Abner, gave utterance to terrible cries when they saw their king lying motionless on the ground with a knife in his stomach. They raised him with great care. Sembobitis, who was highly versed in the science of medicine, saw that he still breathed. He applied a temporary bandage, while Menkera wiped the foam from the king's lips. Then they bound him to a horse and led him gently to the palace of the queen. For 15 days Balthazar lay in the agonies of delirium. He raved without ceasing of the steaming cauldron and the moss in the ravine, and he incessantly cried aloud for Balkis. At last, on the 16th day, he opened his eyes and saw at his bedside Sembobitis and Menkera, but he did not see the queen. "Where is she? What is she doing?" "My lord," replied Menkera, "she is closeted with the king of Commagena." "They are doubtless agreeing to an exchange of merchandise," replied the sage Sembobitis. But be not so disturbed, my lord, or you will redouble your fever." "I must see her!" cried Balthazar, and he flew towards the apartments of the queen, and neither the sage nor the eunuch could restrain him. On nearing the bedchamber he beheld the King of Comagena come forth, covered with gold and glittering like the sun. Balkis, smiling and with eyes closed, lay on a purple couch. "My Balkis, my Balkis!" cried Balthazar. She did not even turn her head, but seemed to prolong a dream. Balthazar approached and took her hand, which she rudely snatched away. "What do you want?" she said. "Do you ask?" the black king answered, and burst into tears. She turned on him her hard, calm eyes. Then he realized that she had forgotten everything, and he reminded her of the night of the dream. "In truth, my lord," said she, "I do not know to what you refer. The wine of the palm does not agree with you. You must have dreamed." "What!" cried the unhappy king, wringing his hands. "Your kisses and the knife which has left its mark on me, are these dreams?" She rose. The jewels on her robe made a sound as of hail and flashed forth lightnings. "My lord," she said, "it is the hour my council assembles. I have not the leisure to interpret the dreams of your suffering brain. Take some repose. Farewell." Balthazar felt himself sinking, but with a supreme effort not to betray his weakness to this wicked woman, he ran to his room, where he fell in a swoon, and his wound reopened. Chapter 4. For 3 weeks he remained unconscious and as one dead, but having on the 22nd day recovered his senses, he seized the hand of Sembobitis, who with Menkera watched over him, and cried, weeping, "O my friends, how happy you are, one to be old and the other the same as old! But no, there is no happiness on earth. Everything is bad, for love is an evil, and Balkis is wicked." "Wisdom confers happiness," replied Sembobitis. "I will try it," said Balthazar. "But let us depart at once for Ethiopia." And as he had lost all he loved, he resolved to consecrate himself to wisdom and to become a mage. If this decision gave him no special pleasure, it at least restored to him something of tranquillity. Every evening, seated on the terrace of his palace, in company with the sage Sembobitis and Menkera the eunuch, he gazed at the palm trees standing motionless against the horizon, or watching the crocodiles by the light of the moon float down the Nile like trunks of trees. "One never wearies of admiring the beauties of nature," said Sembobitis. "Doubtless," said Balthazar, "but there are other things in nature more beautiful even than palm trees and crocodiles." This he said thinking of Balkis, but Sembobitis, who was old, said, "There is, of course, the phenomenon of the rising of the Nile, which I have explained. Man is created to understand." "He is created to love," replied Balthazar, sighing. "There are things which cannot be explained." "And what may those be?" asked Sembobitis. "A woman's treason," the king replied. Balthazar, however, having decided to become a mage, had a tower built from the summit of which might be discerned many kingdoms and the infinite spaces of heaven. The tower was constructed of brick, and rose high above all other towers. It took no less than 2 years to build, and Balthazar expended in its construction the entire treasure of the king his father. Every night he climbed to the top of this tower, and there he studied the heavens under the guidance of the sage Sembobitis. "The constellations of the heavens disclose our destiny," said Sembobitis. And he replied, "It must be admitted, nevertheless, that these signs are obscure. But while I study them I forget Balkis, and that is a great boon." And among truths most useful to know, the mage taught that the stars are fixed like nails in the arch of the sky, and that there are 5 planets, namely Bel, Merodach, and Nebo, which are male, while Zin and Mylitta are female. Silver, he further explained, corresponds to Zin, which is the moon, and iron to Merodach, and tin to Bel. And the worthy Balthazar answered, "Such is the kind of knowledge I wish to acquire. While I study astronomy, I think neither of Balkis nor anything else on earth. The sciences are beneficent. They keep men from thinking. Teach me the knowledge, Sembobitis, which destroys all feeling in men, and I will raise you to great honor among my people." This was the reason that Sembobitis taught the king wisdom. He taught him the power of incantation, according to the principles of Astrampsychus, Gobryas, and Pizzatus; and the more Balthazar studied the 12 houses of the sun, the less he thought of Balkis, and Menkera, observing this, was filled with a great joy. "Acknowledge, my lord, that Queen Balkis, under her golden robes, has little cloven feet like a goat's." "Who ever told you such nonsense?" asked the king. "My lord, it is the common report both in Sheba and Ethiopia," replied the eunuch. "It is universally said that Queen Balkis has a shaggy leg and a foot made of 2 black horns." Balthazar shrugged his shoulders. He knew that the legs and feet of Balkis were like the legs and feet of all other women, and perfect in their beauty. And yet the mere idea spoiled the remembrance of her whom he had so greatly loved. He felt a grievance against Balkis that her beauty was not without blemish in the imagination of those who knew nothing about it. At the thought that he had possessed a woman who, though in reality perfectly formed, passed as a monstrosity, he was seized with such a sense of repugnance that he had no further desire to see Balkis again. Balthazar had a simple soul, but love is a very complex emotion. From that day on the king made great progress both in magic and astrology. He studied the conjunction of the stars with extreme care, and he drew horoscopes with an accuracy equal to that of Sembobitis himself. "Sembobitis," he asked, "are you willing to answer with your head for the truth of my horoscopes?" And the sage Sembobitis replied, "My lord, science is infallible, but the learned often err." Balthazar was endowed with a fine natural sense. He said, "Only that which is true is divine, and what is divine is hidden from us. In vain we search for truth, and yet I have discovered a new star in the sky. It is a beautiful star, and it seems alive, and when it sparkles it looks like a celestial eye that blinks gently. I seem to hear it call to me, 'Happy, happy, happy is he who is born under this star. See, Sembobitis, how this charming and splendid star looks at us.'" But Sembobitis did not see the star because he would not see it. Wise and old, he did not like novelties. And alone in the silence of night, Balthazar repeated, "Happy, happy, happy he who is born under this star." Chapter 5. The rumor spread over all Ethiopia and the neighboring kingdom that King Balthazar had ceased to love Balkis. When the tidings reached the country of Sheba, Balkis was as indignant as if she had been betrayed. She ran to the king of Comagena, who was employing his time in forgetting his country in the city of Sheba. "My friend," she cried, "do you know what I have just heard? Balthazar loves me no longer." "What does it matter," said the king of Comagena, "since we love one another?" "But do you not feel how this blackamoor has insulted me?" "No," said the king of Comagena, "I do not." Whereupon she drove him ignominiously out of her presence, and ordered her grand vizier to prepare for a journey into Ethiopia. "We shall set out this very night, and I shall cut off your head if all is not ready by sundown." But when she was alone she began to sob. "I love him. He loves me no longer. And I love him," she sighed in the sincerity of her heart. And one night, when on his tower watching the miraculous star, Balthazar, casting his eyes towards earth, saw a long black line sinuously curving over the distant sands of the desert like an army of ants. Little by little what seemed to be ants grew larger, and sufficiently distinct for the king to be able to recognize horses, camels, and elephants. The caravan having approached the city, Balthazar distinguished the glittering scimitars and the black horses of the guards of the Queen of Sheba. He even recognized the queen herself, and he was profoundly disturbed, for he felt that he would again love her. The star shone in the zenith with a marvelous brilliancy. Below, extended on a litter of purple and gold, Balkis looked small and brilliant like the star. Balthazar was conscious of being drawn towards her by some terrible power. Still he turned his head away with a desperate effort, and lifting his eyes he again saw the star. Thereupon the star spoke and said, "Glory to God in the heavens, and peace on earth to men of good will." "Take a measure of myrrh, gentle King Balthazar, and follow me. I will guide thee to the feet of a little child who is about to be born in a stable between an ass and an ox. And this little child is the King of kings. He will comfort all those who need comforting. He calls thee to him, O Balthazar, thou whose soul is as dark as thy face, but whose heart is as guileless as the heart of a child. He has chosen thee because thou hast suffered, and he will give thee riches, happiness, and love. He will say to thee, Be poor joyfully, for that is true riches. He will also say to thee, True happiness is in the renunciation of happiness. Love me, and love none other but me, because I alone am love." At these words a divine peace fell like a flood of light over the dark face of the king. Balthazar listened with rapture to the star. He felt himself becoming a new man. Prostrate beside him, Sembobitis and Menkera worshipped, their faces touching the stone. Queen Balkis watched Balthazar. She realized that never again would there be love for her in that heart filled with a love divine. She turned white with rage, and gave orders for the caravan to return at once to the land of Sheba. As soon as the star had ceased to speak, Balthazar and his companions descended from the tower. Then, having prepared a measure of myrrh, they formed a caravan and departed in the direction towards which they were guided by the star. They journeyed a long time through unknown countries, the star always journeying in front of them. One day, finding themselves in a place where three roads met, they saw two kings advance, accompanied by a numerous retinue. One was young and fair of face. He greeted Balthazar and said, "My name is Gaspar. I am a king, and I bear gold as a gift to the child that is about to be born in Bethlehem of Judea." The second king advanced in turn. He was an old man, and his white beard covered his breast. "My name is Melchior," he said, "and I am a king, and I bring frankincense to the holy child who is to teach truth to mankind." "I am bound whither you are," said Balthazar. "I have conquered my lust, and for that reason the star has spoken to me." "I," said Melchior, "have conquered my pride, and that is why I have been called." "I," said Gaspar, "have conquered my cruelty, and for that reason I go with you." And the three mages proceeded on their journey together. The star which they had seen in the east preceded them, until, arriving above the place where the child lay, it stood still, and seeing the star standing still, they rejoiced with a great joy. And entering the house, they found the child with Mary his mother, and prostrating themselves, they worshipped him, and opening their treasures, they offered him gold, frankincense, and myrrh, as it is written in the Gospel.
End of Balthazar by Anatole France. Number 2 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 2, The Christmas Woods, by Marion Storm.
The southern woods hang their Christmas trimmings high. Laurel and rhododendron, mistletoe and holly reach up against the walls of tinted bark. Our northern forests trail greens along the floor, and roped ground pine, pricking through the prone leaves or a gentle snow, appears as a procession of tiny palm trees, come north for the holiday, surprised and lost, but determined to keep together. Under the haw bushes and over spruce roots, wherever shade was thick last summer, Partridge vines twine red-berried wreaths, and the little plants of wintergreen flavor and of that wandering name hold their rubies low on the mountainside. After the enduring snows have come, these glimmering fruits will be requisitioned, dug out by the furry owners of such plantations on days when even covered roots seem barren of sap and nuts should really be saved a while longer. Clumps of sword fern, beaten down by November rains, are round green mats. Other ferns long ago were brown. But seldom, save in its sunsets and woodlands, has December color. Ponds, fanged with ice, lie sullen or stir resentfully into whitecaps. The sky is stony and often vanishes in brooding fog. Uncloaked, but courageous in their gray armor, the trees wait tensely for the intolerable onslaught of the cold, the blizzard with knives of sleet. Over the marshes at the hour of dusk, when the bronze and topaz are quenched, passes the breath of foreboding. December acknowledges an unpitying fate. Anything may happen. It is not the fireside month, softly white outdoors and candle lit within. Time of miracles, it stands expectant, and the thronging stars of the Christmas midnight wear a restless look. Rutted paths answer harshly to the step. Delayed snow is a menace in the air, but lands beyond the cities would be grateful should it hasten, bringing safety to the soil and winter peace. Yet snow is a betrayer, a sheet of paper upon which the feet of rabbit, mink, and fox write a guide to their dwellings and to the whole plan of their days. Snow for Christmas there must be, on the lighted trees indoors, on our far scattered similar cards. But save as a convenience to the reindeer and a compliment to their driver, who cannot create his stocking stock unless he is snowbound, and who must feel sadly languid as he tears through Florida heavens, city people would quite willingly manage with alum. Early in school life, however, comes the dangerous knowledge that nothing is so easy to draw as Christmas Eve. A white hillside, a path of one unchanging curve, a steeple or a chimney with smoke, a fir tree or a star. Thus snow eases art for the credulous who think it white. Glittering under starlight shadowed with purple, lemon, or deep blue as sunset turns to evening, taking on daffodil hues at noon, snow is harder to paint. Fretted with windy tracery and drawn out into streaming lines, where the gale races along by a fence, snow is not, on Christmas greetings, permitted to be seen. The first snowstorm of the year should be sent from Labrador on Christmas Eve, and sprinkled impartially and ornamentally over all the land. Then, the Yule atmosphere once provided, the distribution should be confined to the rural clientele until the next December, for on streets the hoar-frost is indeed like ashes. But why, in somber justice, should the far South pretend to holiday snow at all? Why not Christmas cards pranked with live oaks, alligators, lagoons, and other beauties of an Everglade scene, an inspiring escape from tradition and sentiment? For the antlered steeds must prance above hibiscus flowers as well as round the pole. Yet it must seem dull to hang stockings by a fireplace that needs fire merely as a decoration, and never to have loved a sleigh. Abandoned but still no downcast company, slanting corn shocks not honored with winter shelter stand patient sentinels in the field. Abandoned they may seem, yet could you suddenly tip one over, there would be a startled scurrying, for these are the choice snow-time residences of field mice, cottontails, weasels, and meadow moles, not, of course, together in harmony, but in their separate establishments. Let the blizzard come, it only makes warmer a house of cornstalks properly built, which bears nevertheless some of the dangers of a gingerbread home. Passing cows may feel tempted. Vermilion heraldry of the wild rose is waved undimmed. Witch hazel, with her yellow blossoms, last flower of the year, gazes upon the vanquished shrubs about her with a smile. Why, she will not even sow her seed until February. There is plenty of time for hardy petals. Massed against the stern horizon, the forest stands an unresponsive gray. Entered, the twigs are seen sleek brown, dark red, and a fawn soft as the tan orchid. In towns, December shows the iron mood, but in the open places, where pools of light and shadow lie, it is a water-color month, made fine with no gorgeous velvets of autumn, but hung with blending veils of dawn mist and of new snow, so that the subdued day rises in flushed, drifting vapors, like April's awakening, and when the sun comes pale, we wonder that there is no summons in his light.
End of The Christmas Woods by Marion Storm. Number 3 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 3, The Bachelors' Christmas.
1. Thomas Wiggin, or Tom Wiggin, as everyone called him, sat alone in his bachelor quarters on Christmas Eve, waiting for a carriage. The carriage was not late, but Tom, who was a methodical man in everything he did, had finished his preparations a little sooner than need be. His fur coat and hat and gloves lay on a chair beside him, ready to put on the moment Bridget, the maid, should knock at the door and tell him that Perkins, the cabby at the corner, was blocking the way. Tom had already taken out of his pocket 2 $10 gold pieces and laid them on the center table beside an array of packages done up with marvelous care in the whitest of paper and the reddest of ribbon. One of the gold pieces was for Bridget and the other for Perkins. Twice the sum would not have replaced the crockery and objects of virtue which the Hibernian handmaiden who brought up his breakfast and was supposed to keep his room tidy had smashed since he had tipped her last. And Tom had, only 2 months before, undergone the melancholy experience of falling through the bottom of Perkins' coupe because of the pertinacity with which that common carrier of passengers clung to the delusion that no repairs to a vehicle were necessary until it dropped to pieces. But, as Tom would have said if interrogated on the subject by a subtler mind, Christmas comes but once a year, and though Bridget's best was her worst, she had tried to do it, and Perkins, shiftless as he was, had driven his poor old nag one day into a pink lather in endeavoring to catch a train for him, which he had just missed after all. Besides, Tom had had a remarkably good business year, so that a $10 gold piece did not seem to him the dazzlingly large sum he had regarded it 10 years earlier. He had lived in these same bachelor lodgings for 10 years, and during that time had built up a very neat business by his own unaided effort, as his contemporaries, and contemporaries are apt to be stern critics, were ready to admit. He had worked hard and steadily, taking only enough vacation to enable him to keep well, and shunting everything to the background which threatened to interfere with the object he had in view, that is, everything but one thing. And this one thing, he had made up his mind 5 years ago, was out of the question. Consequently, he had shunted it to the background with everything else, and devoted himself more unreservedly than ever to the real estate business. 10 years is quite a piece out of any man's life, and though Tom Wiggin was the picture of health, he was, as we say colloquially, no longer a chicken. He was stouter than he had been, and had lost some of his hair, which gave him rather a middle-aged appearance, or at least suggested that he never would see 35 again. When he had taken his present room he had been a slim and almost delicate-looking stripling, without a copper, whom any girl might be likely to fancy. To-day, in his own estimation and in that of his friends and acquaintances, he was a well-seasoned old bachelor who was not likely to ask anyone feminine to share his comfortable competency. Christmas comes but once a year, and Tom had for several years past been in the habit of recognizing the fact in his special way. He was extensively an uncle. That is to say, he had 2 married sisters, one with 5 and the other with 3 children of tender age, and each of his 2 married brothers had presented him with a nephew and niece of the name of Wiggin. Categorically speaking, he had 7 nephews and 5 nieces to provide with Christmas gifts, not to mention his 2 sisters and his 2 sisters-in-law, all of whom had grown accustomed to expect a package in white paper tied with pink ribbon and marked "With love and a Merry Christmas from Tom." Here were 16 presents to begin with, and there were apt to be almost as many more. On this particular Christmas evening there were 35 parcels in all, each done up with immaculate care, for Tom, like most other bachelors, prided himself on doing everything in a thorough, deliberate fashion. He had made his last purchase a fortnight ago, and had spent 2 entire evenings in putting the array of toys and fancy goods in presentable order. They were of all sorts and sizes, for Tom had paled neither before bulk nor price. There was a safety bicycle for a nephew who had set his heart on one, and the tiniest of gold watches for his eldest niece. There was a warm fur-lined cloak for his dead mother's oldest friend, a spinster lady who had small means wherewith to keep herself comfortable in a cold world, and a case of marvelous port for his old chum Belden, who would see that it was not wasted on unappreciative palates. Everything was ready for the summons from Perkins, the cabby, and Tom, bald-headed bachelor that he was fuming a little in spite of the fact that it still lacked 3 minutes of the hour appointed for departure. The clock in the neighboring church tower, whose tones were plainly audible in the sky parlors, which he called his home, had only just struck 5 when the tramp of feet, followed by a knock, announced the joint arrival of Bridget and Perkins, to whom he had entrusted the duty of helping him to carry his precious parcels down 3 flights of stairs to the attendant cab. This was the 6th consecutive year Bridget and Perkins had done the same thing, and they thought they knew what to expect. But they had counted without their host. A year ago they had chuckled for 48 hours over a $5 bill apiece. Now, when they opened the door and presented their grinning countenances, their benefactor, after shouting at them a Merry Christmas, proceeded to daze their intellects, of every particle of which they stood in sore need for the purpose of a safe descent, by tossing to each of them a gold coin of twice the denomination. For some moments they stood in bewildered, sheepish silence, examining their treasure, as though to make certain it was genuine. Then Bridget, taxing her intelligence for a suitable expression for the wealth of feeling at her heart, exclaimed, "And sure, Mr. Wiggin, it's Bridget Lanigan that's hoping that before the good Lord brings anither Christmas day, the proudest lady in the land will be your wife. It's me and Perkins would be the first to say God bless her, though we lost a good job by it." At this prodigal outburst of expectation, Tom Wiggin's countenance grew rosy red, notwithstanding the incredulous laugh with which he received the blessing of his warm-hearted handmaiden and the nods of the less nimble-witted cabman. Then a shadow crossed it, as though of unhappy recollection, and there was a tinge of real hopelessness in his half-jocular protestation. "Many thanks, Bridget, for your good wishes, but there's no such luck in store for me. I shall live and die an old bachelor, such as you see me now, and you and Perkins will be able to count on a $10 gold piece on Christmas Eve for the rest of your lives. That is," Tom added by way of timely warning, "provided you don't smash any of these things of mine in carrying them downstairs. You remember that the pair of you last year between you broke a teacup worth its weight in gold, and the year before that a large vase broke itself. If everything were to go down safely, I should almost begin to believe that what Bridget hopes might come true. Careful now, and be sure not to lay that bicycle right on top of the gilt-edged dinner plates for my sister Mary." Whether it was that Tom's strictures in regard to the clumsiness of his assistants were exaggerated, or they were bent on causing him to repose trust in Bridget's prophecy, the 35 packages reached the cab and were stowed within and without, under their owner's supervising eye, without a single casualty. "Faith, Mr. Wiggin, they'll be takin' yer this time for Santa Claus, sure," said Perkins, when the last precious parcel had been deposited. "You'll have to ride outside, sir, as you did last year." Evidently the gaping file of small boys which had formed itself on each side of the doorway was of the opinion that if the gentleman in the fur coat was not Santa Claus, he was one of his blood relations. For as Tom climbed carefully to his post beside Perkins, so as not to hazard the safety of the bicycle and the box of port, for which there was no room inside, they broke out into a shrill hurrah. Perhaps they, too, or at least some of them, knew what they had to expect, for before Santa Claus seated himself on the box, he plunged his hands into the side pockets of his fur overcoat, and then, reproducing them, seemed to toss them high to the winds as he cried, with gay goodwill, "Scramble now, you little devils! Scramble, and wish you Merry Christmas!" What Tom flung to the winds was neither his fingers nor his thumbs, but a plethora of bright nickels which he had drawn from the bank for the express purpose. As the glittering shower of brand-new 5-cent pieces fell to the icy sidewalk, the band of urchins threw themselves upon it with a shout of transport which drew tears from the eyes of the tender-hearted Bridget, who had remained to witness this established ceremony, and ought to have warmed the cockles of the donor's heart, if indeed they needed warming. Twice again he replunged his hands into his pockets, and twice again the yell was repeated. Then, seating himself beside Perkins, Tom gave the signal for departure, and as the cab rounded the corner, a score of little lungs gave him back his Merry Christmas with all their might. It was a genuine Christmas Eve. The ground was covered with snow, and the sleigh bells were jangling merrily. The lamps were already lighted, and many a parlor window gave out the reflection of wreaths of holly, and now and again sparkled with little rows of candles in token of the precious Christmas anniversary. Perkins' coupé was on wheels, and his equine paradox was imperfectly caulked into the bargain, so that the world seemed to be rushing by them as they jogged along. Tom had a list which he from time to time consulted by the allied light of the moon and the street lamps, in order to see that his itinerary was accurately followed and no one forgotten. At every house he dismounted in person and handed in his present. When he reached the residence of his sister, Mary Ferris, who was the mother of the 5 children, he had to make 4 trips up and down the doorsteps. His sister, who was listening, recognized his voice and came into the vestibule to meet him, and her children, bounding in her wake like an elated pack of wolves, shouted with one tongue, "Hurrah! It's Uncle Tom!" Mrs. Ferris sent them scampering upstairs in double-quick time, on pain of dire penalties if they peeped or listened, and fondly drew her brother into the small sitting-room which opened out of the hall. "I can't stop, Mary," he said. "I'm on my annual circuit. Now let's see if I've got everything. Here's the bicycle for Roger, Jr. They call it a safety, and I trust it may prove so. And the Noah's Ark, the largest one made, for Harry. And a musical box which plays 8 tunes for Dorothy. And a doll which sings Ta-ra-boom-de-ay for little Mary. And a woolly lamb for baby Ned. And here's a trifle in the crockery line for you, my dear. If you don't like the pattern, you can change them. Now I must be off. How's Roger Sr.? Give him my love and a Merry Christmas. He'll be home very soon, Tom, and dreadfully sorry to have missed you. The children are just crazy about their stockings, and little Roger had given up all hope of a bicycle. You are too generous to them and to all of us. And, oh, Tom," she added, laying her hand upon his arm, "I feel dreadfully that we shan't have you with us at dinner to-morrow, but old Mr. Ferris depends on Roger and me for Christmas. He says it may be the last time, and that Christmas is the Ferris day. Thanksgiving is the Wiggin day, you know, and we did have a jolly time then. Yet I just hate to think of your not dining with one of us on Christmas. How can it be helped, though, if all the things-in-law have family parties? Why, that's all right, Mary. As you say, Thanksgiving is the Wiggin day, and things-in-law have rights as well as those they marry. Merry Christmas, dearest, and let me go, or I shall never get through my list." "Ah, but Tom, love, I do wish you were married," she cried, putting her arms around his neck to detain him. She was his favorite sister, and free to introduce dangerous topics with due discretion. "You would be so much happier." "Do I seem so miserable?" he inquired, as he looked down at her and stroked her hair. "That's an old story, Mary. I've heard you express the same wish every 6 months for the last 10 years. Every family should have one old bachelor at least, and I shall be ours." She was silent for an instant. "Do you ever see Isabelle Hardy nowadays?" she asked, with brave insistence. "I have sometimes thought " She stopped, deterred from completing her sentence by the shadow which had come over Tom's face. He gently but firmly removed his sister's arms from his neck and answered gravely, almost stiffly, "Very rarely indeed." Then, with a fresh access of gaiety, as though he were resolved that nothing foreign to the occasion should mar its spirit, he cried lustily, "A Merry Christmas to you, Mary," and departed. Continuing steadily on his round, Tom delivered safely the case of port and the fur-lined cloak, and brought up in the next street in front of his brother Joe's house. Here he was to leave the gold watch for his eldest niece, a generous box of bonbons for his sister-in-law, a tool chest for young Joe, and a first edition of Vanity Fair for Joe himself, who, though not particularly well off, was a rabid book collector. Tom had dogged an auctioneer for 2 days to make sure of obtaining the volume in question, which, so far as he could see, was like as 2 peas to the subsequent issues of the same book to be bought anywhere for a song. He was convinced of his mistake when he saw his brother's face light up at sight of the treasure trove and heard his delighted inquiry, "Where on earth did you pick this up, Tom? You couldn't have given me anything I'd rather have." "Glad you like it, Joe. If it isn't the real thing, I'll have the hide of that fellow Nevins who sold it to me." "The real thing? It's a genuine first edition, and a splendid specimen. It's adorable. I say, old fellow, it's an outrage that we're to dine with Julia's father to morrow and leave you out in the cold. Another year I mean to strike and have a Wigan Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving or no Thanksgiving. Mary and I were comparing notes yesterday and vowing it was an infernal shame. Now, it's all right as it is, Joe. I've just left Mary, and I understand perfectly. You've got enough to do to digest your father-in-law's mince pie and Madeira without having me on your stomach. A regular old-fashioned 10-course feed where you sit down at 7 and get up at 10:30 feeling like lead. Ugh! Where are you going to dine, Tom?" "No matter. That's my secret. I shall have a good dinner, never you fear. I must be off now and deliver the rest of my goods." "It's an outrage, an infernal outrage," growled Joe. "Before you go, old man," he said, hooking his arm into his brother's and dragging him in the direction of the dining room, "we'll have a drink. I put a pint of fizz on the ice this morning for your special benefit. It won't take 2 minutes to mix the cocktail." Thereupon Joe gave the bell handle a wrench and directed that the bottle in the ice chest should be brought up together with the cracked ice which he had ordered to be in readiness, and in a very short space of time the white-capped maid reappeared with a waiter laden with all the necessary ingredients for the delectable beverage in question. Joe carefully measured out some bitters, pop went the cork of the Perrier Jouet, and presently the brothers were looking at each other over 2 brimming glasses. "Wish you Merry Christmas, Joe." "Wish you Merry Christmas, Tom. And here's to her." Joe paused an instant before he drank, to add, "It's a big mistake you're not married, Tom. All I can say is some girl is losing a first-class husband. I say, here's to her." Tom, who had waited at the words, raised his glass solemnly. "There is no her, and there never will be," he said, with quiet decision. "Still, since you give the toast, Joe, I'll drink it. It's not poisonous," he added, with a wry smile. "So here's to her." He drained his glass and set it down on the waiter, then for an instant stood ruminantly with his back to the open fire. "The drink was better than the toast in my case, Joe. My her must have died in infancy." "Honest Injun, Tom?" asked Joe, as he gripped his brother's hand, held out for a parting shake, and looked into his face. Tom's eyes quailed before the honest gaze. His lip quivered. "I'm an infernal liar, Joe, and you know it. But what's the use? She wouldn't have me, man, and there's no one else whom I want to have. So Merry Christmas, Joe, and God bless you and yours." As he went out into the frosty night, the clock in the hall struck 6:30. There were only 5 parcels left, and the coupé was nearly empty. Tom opened the door and, stepping inside, lay back wearily. Presently he picked up one of the parcels. It was a book, apparently from its shape, and laid it at his side. When Perkins drew up the next time, Tom gathered up the remaining 4 and ran up the steps with them. They were for his sister Kitty and her little company, and he spent a few moments indoors to explain matters. When he reappeared, he said to his conductor, "114 Farragut Place, and then to the club." Tom sat inside with the remaining package resting on his lap, nervously watching for the cab to stop. They halted presently before a spacious house, the old-fashioned aspect of which was heightened by the curved iron railing which ran along the flight of steps leading up to it. Just before the cab stopped, Tom had taken a note from his breast pocket, and after looking round him stealthily in the darkness, had kissed the envelope. Now he tucked it under the red ribbon of the remaining package, and walking gravely up the steps, rang the bell. There was nothing in the envelope but his visiting card, on which he had written, "With best wishes for a Merry Christmas." When the servant came to the door, Tom said, "Will you please give this to Miss Isabel Hardy?" Then the door closed in his face, and he went solemnly down the steps again. On reaching the now empty cab, he glanced over his shoulder as though in hope of catching a face at the window, but every shade was down, and the wreaths of holly were the nearest semblance to faces, and they seemed almost to grin at him. And well they might. It was the 5th year in succession that he had gone through exactly this same pantomime. Tom heaved one deep sigh. Then he straightened his shoulders and passed his hands across his eyes, as though he were sweeping away an unprofitable vision. "To the club," he repeated sturdily to Perkins. "And now," he said to himself as he shrouded himself in his fur coat and put up his feet on the opposite cushion, "the question is how to make the best of a devilish poor outlook. I mean to have a Merry Christmas somehow." II. Though it was dinner time, there were few men in the club when Tom entered it. Still, there was a half-dozen familiar spirits lounging in the sitting-room, most melancholy among whom was Fraser Bell, a bachelor far gone in his 40s, an epicure, but poor as a church mouse. "Just the man," said Tom to himself, and he drew him aside. "Will you dine with me to-night, Fraser?" "I've just ordered dinner, but—" "Then I'll countermand it," interposed Tom, blithely, by way of relieving his would-be guest from the quandary of accepting the invitation without loss of self-respect. "It's Christmas Eve, and this is my outfit. I'm going in for as good a dinner as they can give us in honor of the occasion. I say, old man, will you do me the favor to order it? You know 50 times better than I what we ought to have to get the best." Fraser Bell grinned melodiously. One could almost see his mouth water. "I'll do it if you like," he said. "I wish you would. And be sure to put down the finest there is, and to pick out something gilt-edged in the way of wine, something cobwebby and precious." "I'll try," said Fraser, with another grin, and he ambled off in the direction of the office. Tom went into the reading-room and picked up a magazine. Presently he passed his hands across his eyes again, for the wreaths in the window of the house in Farragut Place were grinning at him still. He said to himself that he guessed he needed another drink, and pressed the electric button at his side. "Ask Mr. Fraser Bell what he'll have, and bring me a martini cocktail," he said to the servant. Then he shut his eyes, and the grinning wreaths changed into a girl's face, a face which had haunted him day in and day out for 7 years. He knew that he ought to brush that away also, but he could not bring himself to do it on Christmas Eve. He would give himself that little luxury at least before he tried to obliterate it by talking gastronomy with Fraser Bell. Nearly 7 years, verily, since he had seen her first. She was then a girl of 19, and he at the bottom of the real estate ladder without a dollar to his name, as it were. He had been crazy to marry her, and for 2 years he had followed her from ballroom to ballroom with a feverish assiduity which threatened to revolutionize his business habits and make light of his business principles. He was not the only one in love with her. There were half a dozen. But the one whose devotion he dreaded most was Charles Leverett Saunders, a handsome, dashing beau, a scion of a rich and conspicuous house. He had watched her behavior towards his rival with the eye of a lynx, and as he compared the notes of one evening with the notes of the next, he had felt that she was more gracious to Saunders than to him. And yet sometimes she was so sweet and kind to him. But then again she would be cold and distant, almost icy, in short, on which occasions he had felt as though he would like to cut his throat. A half-dozen times he had made up his mind to offer himself to her and know his fate. But somehow his determination, which was so prodigious in other affairs, had failed him. So matters had gone on for a year and a half, and he had seemed no nearer and no less near to the goal than ever. He had said to himself severely that this thing must not go on. On December 31st, just 5 years ago, there was to be a famous ball, the crack party of the season. He had resolved that before the old year was out he would know his fate once and for all. $10 gold pieces did not grow for him then on every bush, but he ordered from the florist the handsomest bouquet of roses and violets which native horticultural talent could devise, and sent it to Miss Isabel Hardy on the eve of the ball. She had promised to dance the German with him, and when he entered the ballroom his eyes saw no one until they rested on her. A frown had creased his brow, for she was on the arm of Charles Leverett Saunders, and was looking up into his face with a smile of happy excitement which had suggested to Tom that he was as far from her thoughts as the Emperor of Japan. What was more and worse, she carried 3 gorgeous bouquets, but his was not among them. Where was it? Had it not been sent? If so, he would ruin that florist's trade forever and ever. Or had she left it at home on purpose? He fought shy of her until the German, and there was no longer an excuse for him to keep away. Almost at once she thanked him for his lovely flowers. "But you have not brought them." "No," she said sweetly, "I was unable to. And she had paused in her embarrassment. "There were so many, of course." "No, it was not that, Mr. Wiggin, I assure you." But she had looked a little hurt at his gruff words. "I had a very good reason for not bringing them." There had been a piteous look in the girl's eyes as she spoke, which he had often recalled since. But then he had thought of nothing but his anger and the slight which had been put upon him. He felt like asking why she had not left Charles Leverett Saunders' flowers at home instead of his. It was clear that she did not care for him, and it became clearer and clearer in the course of the evening. For after a while they had sat almost tongue-tied beside each other. He had tried his best not to be disagreeable, but in spite of himself, cynical sentences had slipped from between his teeth in close succession. He had seen that she was hurt, and he had rather gloried in it, and presently an embarrassed silence had followed, broken by the arrival of his rival with a magnificent favor proffered beamingly to the girl of Tom's heart. She had sailed away, and, looking back over her shoulder, given Tom one glance, one of those icy glances which made him yearn to cut his throat. That was bad enough, but to crown all, when her turn came to bestow a boutonniere, she made Tom carry her straight up to Leverett Saunders, in the buttonhole of whose coat she proceeded to fasten the rosebud for which Tom would have given 12 months of his life. 5 years ago, on the 1st of January, he had gone home that night, certain that Isabel Hardy did not love him, and resolved that she should play fast and loose with him no longer. In the first hours of the new year he vowed that he would forget her and devote himself to his business, heart and soul. Henceforth he would close eye and brain to all distractions. He would cease forever to be a plaything for a woman's caprice. He had kept his word. That is to say, his attentions had ended from that hour. The festivities which had known him knew him no more. He went nowhere, and the reason whispered under the rose was that Isabel Hardy had given him the mitten. The whisper reached him, but little he cared that rumor was not strictly accurate. Was it not practically so? She had to all intents and purposes thrown him over, and he had expelled her image from his heart and gone on with his business, looking neither to the right nor to the left. Occasionally he passed her in the street, and on every Christmas Eve since the night of his resolution he had left a trifling remembrance at the house in Farragut Place, just as it were to show that there was no ill feeling. Otherwise they never met, and here he was to-day, an old bachelor, close on 40, getting bald and set in his ways, with a splendid business and a secret ache at his heart. And she? Tom had never known why she had not married Charles Leverett Saunders, as everybody expected and said she was going to do. Yet suddenly, without warning, that dashing gallant had gone abroad, and had remained there ever since, doing the Nile and Norway, and hunting tigers in the jungles of India, according as the humor seized him. And she? She was beginning to show just a little the traces of time, to suggest what she would look like if she never married and remained, after all, an old maid. He had been struck by it the last time he had passed her in the street. An old maid! Isabelle Hardy an old maid! There was bitter humor in it for Tom, and he laughed aloud in the reading room, then, starting at his own performance, looked around him confusedly. He was alone, and his untasted drink stood at his elbow. No one had heard his harsh, strange outburst. He tossed off the cocktail and sank back in his easy-chair to confront the vision. An old maid, and he was an old bachelor, and it was Christmas Eve. And what a gloomy, diabolical anniversary it was for old maids and old bachelors. They had no things-in-law to invite them to dinner. They were out in the cold, and their room was better than their company. Jokes, jollities, they were all matrimonial and centered about babies' teeth or Noah's arks. The only thing for an old bachelor or old maid to do was to ransack toy shops and then stand aside. Merry Christmas? How in the name of Santa Claus was an old bachelor or an old maid to have a Merry Christmas? And why in time shouldn't they be merry if they could? 5 minutes later the servant had to announce twice that dinner was served before Tom turned his head, which caused that functionary to reflect that Mr. Wiggin was getting a little deaf. He was looking straight before him into the fire, as though he were interested in the processes of combustion or the price of coal. He turned at the second summons with a start. "What's that, Simon? Mr. Bell waiting for me? Oh, of course. Dinner is ready. Tell him, he added with a feverish, excited manner as he sprang to his feet, that I'll be with him in a moment. I must use the telephone first. I'll put it through," he added to himself as he dashed from the room, "if it takes a leg." Whatever Tom was bent on almost cost him a bone of some sort at the start, for just beyond the door of the reading room he bumped full into George Hapgood, a stout, dignified-looking man of about 50. When Tom realized who it was, his eyes gleamed joyously, and in lieu of an apology he blurted out, "You're just the man I'm looking for, Hapgood. Will you do me the favor to dine with me to-morrow? Now don't say you can't, for you must." "To-morrow? To-morrow's Christmas, isn't it?" was the inquiry, with just a shade of melancholy in the tone. "Yes, and we're out of it, two old bachelors like you and me. I'm going to bring a few choice spirits together to prove that the things-in-law can't have all the fun. Say you'll come. Here at 7. I was going to dine with my brother, but I got a telegram from him this afternoon saying that the children had broken out with scarlet fever and—" "I understand, old man. So did mine. I mean, we're all in the same boat. Then I shall count on you at 7. "Thank you kindly, Wiggin. I'll be glad to come," answered Hapgood, with a grave, courteous bow. Tom remembered having heard it said that Hapgood had never really smiled since his lady love, Marian Blake, married Willis Bowles 25 years before. He was a brilliant lawyer and an influential man, but he had never been known to smile, and he habitually fought shy of all entertainments where the other sex was to be encountered, as though he feared contagion. "I thought I wouldn't tell him that there might be women. It'll do him good to meet a few," chuckled Tom as he pursued his way to the telephone box. "Is that Albion Hall?" "Yes, sah." "Is Mr. Maxwell there?" "No, sah. Mr. Maxwell's gone home." "Who are you?" "The janitor, sah." "Is the hall engaged for to-morrow night?" "Can't say, sah. Haven't any orders. You mean Christmas night, sah?" "Yes, to-morrow. Christmas." "Likely not, sah." "Where does Mr. Maxwell live?" "Plainville, sah." Do you wish to make a $10 bill, janitor?" "Very well. Take a carriage and drive out to Plainville as tight as you can fetch it, and find out if Mr. Thomas Wiggin he knows me can have the hall to-morrow night. Tell Mr. Maxwell that if he'll meet me at my rooms at 8 o'clock to-morrow, Christmas morning, I'll add 25% to the price. Do you understand? Now repeat what I've said to you." "That's right. Go along now and report to me at the Blackstone Club as soon as you get back. And for every 5 minutes which you take from an hour and a half, I'll add an extra $1 to the 10." Tom looked at his watch reflectively. It was 7:15. He must dine first, if only not to break faith with Fraser Bell, whom he had kept waiting abominably long already. He stopped an instant, however, at the office on his way to join Fraser, so as to make sure that he could have the large green dining room for the following evening. "To-morrow's Christmas, you know, Mr. Wiggin," suggested the steward respectfully. "I know it, Dunkley. Is there any reason why I shouldn't have a dinner party on Christmas Day?" "Oh, no, sir, of course not. I merely thought that perhaps you were going to dine elsewhere and had forgotten it was Christmas Day." "I dine here. And I wish a dinner for, say, 16. I can't tell the precise number yet. A ladies' dinner. And I wish it to be as handsome as possible. You mustn't fail me," he added, noticing that the steward looked rather dismayed. "Start your messengers at once, and spare no expense if you have to drag the butchers from their beds to get what you need. I'll see to the flowers myself. I have a greenhouse in my mind's eye, which I intend to buy solidly for the occasion." "Very well, Mr. Wiggin. I'll do my best, though it's late to begin, sir." Fraser Bell was sitting before his raw oysters, the picture of polite despair, seeing in his mind's eye the delicate dinner which he had ordered being done to death and getting lukewarm. "My dear fellow, I owe you 1,000 pardons, but I had to telephone. If our dinner is spoiled, or whether it is or not, I want you to promise to dine with me to-morrow night. I have evolved a scheme while we were waiting, which I will unfold to you presently. Go on with your oysters. I hope you will forgive me." "To-morrow? Christmas?" "Yes. I propose to give an entertainment to all the old bachelors and maiden ladies of my acquaintance, if they'll come. A dinner here, followed by a dance at Albion Hall, and Dunkley is arranging for the dinner. I'm going to invite all the old-timers, and I need your advice as to the list. For a starter, I'll put down the 3 Belknap girls." Tom whipped out his pencil and proceeded to utilize the back of the bill of fare, which Fraser had drawn up to gloat over. "See first what you're going to eat, old man." "It's sure to be admirable if you ordered it. It has always been a matter of wonder to me that neither of those Belknap girls have married. Then there's Georgina Dixon in the same block. Glad I remembered her. Charming girl, too. She ought to have been married years ago. Come to think of it, you used to be a friend of hers, Fraser." "Yes, I did. What on earth are you up to, Tom? Are you in earnest?" "Never more so in my life. I tell you there's a tacit conspiracy in this town. I dare say it's all over the planet, against us poor wretches who are old enough to be married and haven't, and they, the married ones I mean, like to keep us out in the cold, as a sort of punishment, may be, because we've chosen to remain single. I'm sick of it, for one, and I'm going to organize a revolution. I'm going to have a grand family meeting of all the poor lonely spirits like you and me and the Belknap girls and Georgina Dixon and George Hapgood and the things-in-law may go to the devil. Now put your wits on this thing, Fraser, while you disintegrate your terrapin. Come, girls first." "Do you suppose they'll ever come?" asked Fraser with an amazed grin. He was essentially a conventional man without a spark of imagination, and he could scarcely believe that Tom was really in earnest. "They've got to come. Why shouldn't they come?" "They'll think it queer." "It isn't queer. It's righteous." "All right. Put down the Miss Mamie Scott. She will never see 30 again." "Capital! Poor soul! A girl to make any man happy." "There's Susan Davis." "Oh, to be sure. She isn't pretty, but she's good." "Joe Elliott used to be partial to her before he ran a rig with that smug-faced doll who jilted him. What a fool he was! We'll ask him, too." To tell the truth, even the gastronomic Fraser Bell, in spite of the fact that the dinner was very far from spoiled, presently forgot what he was eating and drinking in the absorbing process of selection. By the time the cheese and a rare glass of Burgundy arrived, the list was finished, and Tom was eager to escape to the reading room to prepare the notes of invitation, which must be sent at once. There were 46 in all to be invited, out of which he hoped to secure enough for a full-fledged dinner party. Those who could not come to dinner were to be urged to join them at Albion Hall later. The matter of wording the invitation was a serious one, and Tom sat feeling of the bald spot on his crown for several minutes. At last, with a desperate air, he plunged his pen into the inkstand and wrote as follows to Miss Madeline Belknap: My dear Miss Belknap, I beg as a favor that you and both your sisters will honor me with your company at dinner to morrow, December 25th, at the Blackstone Club at 7 o'clock. I am bringing together, in celebration of a bachelor's Christmas, a number of kindred spirits who have no things-in-law to cater to their sympathetic needs, and yet who have a no less equal right to a Merry Christmas. After dinner we shall adjourn to Albion Hall to dance, to which I trust that you or some of you, if unable to dine with me, will come at 10 o'clock. With the compliments of the season and the sincere hope that you will oblige me, I am, very sincerely yours, Thomas Wiggin. How is that, Fraser? I guess that's all right, said Fraser, in a tone which suggested that he was far from sure whether it was not all wrong. Perfectly respectful and to the point, isn't it? Yes. Hold on, Tom. How about a chaperone? They won't come without a chaperone. Tom bit his lip. I won't have a chaperone. I'll be blank if I will have a chaperone. He puckered his brow gloomily. Then, with a sudden wave of his hand, he cried, I have it. Thereupon he dashed off this postscript. P.S. We are all old enough to take care of ourselves. For the next 2 hours Tom and Fraser devoted themselves with feverish industry to the task of writing the 200 invitations. In such an emergency forgery seemed allowable, and without attempting to imitate the Wiggin chirography, Fraser boldly signed the name of Thomas. As soon as every half-dozen notes were finished, they were hurried to their destination by special messengers. The clock struck 10:30 when the last was done. Tom handed over to the boy in attendance the final batch, all save a single one. While he was writing this, he could have written half a dozen of the others, and now that it was written and addressed, he drew it from the envelope to read once more the words which he had penned so carefully. Their tenor was essentially the same, but he had stricken out a phrase or two here and added a phrase or two there to make sure that she would understand the nature of the invitation. Then he arose with it in his hand and said, Good night, Fraser. 1,000 thanks. I'll leave this one myself. Wish you a Merry Christmas. 3. At 6:30 on the evening of Christmas Day, Tom Wiggin stood in the large green dining room of the Blackstone Club, surveying a magnificently appointed table. Roses, pansies, and violets from the greenhouse, which he had bought out at 10 o'clock that morning, lay tastefully banked and scattered upon the cloth, intertwined with masses of evergreen and holly gay with berries. Christmas wreaths and festoons were lavishly arranged around the walls. Dunkley had assured him that there should be no dearth of palatable viands, and, most important fact of all, there had been 20 acceptances for dinner, happily just 10 men and 10 women, and nearly a dozen more acceptances for the dance. He had been in a mad whirl since daybreak, but he believed now that he had accomplished everything except to arrange the seats at table, which needed a little quiet reflection. The answers had begun to arrive shortly after breakfast. The first had been a refusal, a little curt and stiff in tone, as though the lady in question, notwithstanding the fact that she had promised to dine with one of her family, wished to give him to understand that she took herself too seriously to accept such an invitation under any circumstances. Tom's heart sank within him, and he said to himself that he had made a mess of it. 5 minutes later his features were as complacent as those of a Cheshire cat. The Misses Belknap were coming, all 3 of them. They had ordered dinner at home, but were coming notwithstanding to help Mr. Wiggin pass a Merry Christmas and confound the things-in-law. They are 3 noble sports, Tom had said to himself, as he danced around his apartment, waving the mildly scented note. Other answers came quick and fast. Of course, many had engagements, but most of these expressed deep regret at their inability to attend, and several who could not come to dinner promised to put in an appearance at the dance. There were a few other chilling refusals. Miss Susan Davis, whom Tom had characterized as not pretty but good, let him perceive very plainly that she considered the invitation indelicate. On the other hand, Miss Mamie Scott, who would never see 30 again, had written him spiritedly that it was a comfort to know that she was old enough to take care of herself, and that she was coming without her mother for the first time in her life. And she? Tom had not heard until nearly noon, and he had realized, as he held the little neatly sealed note in his hand, that if she were going to fail him his pleasure in the whole business would be utterly gone. His wrist shook as though he had the palsy, and he hated to look. She was coming. Yes, she was coming. Her father and mother were going to dine with her brother-in-law, and though she had promised to do the same, she thought she would enjoy better the very original dinner to which he had invited her. "And as you say," she wrote in conclusion, "we are certainly old enough to take care of ourselves." She was coming. Yes, she was coming. And whatever happened now, he was going to have a Merry Christmas. And how was he to seat them? It was rather a nice problem. To begin with, Tom sandwiched in George Hapgood between the eldest Miss Belknap and Miss Mamie Scott, which was as delightful a situation as any man could wish to have. Fraser Bell must go beside Georgiana Dixon, and Harry Abercrombie, who had been dangling for years in the train of Angelina Phillips until everybody was tired, should take her in and have the second Miss Belknap on his other side. Tom was making pretty good progress, but what really troubled him was whether it would do for him to place Isabelle Hardy next to himself. Would not such a proceeding be quite inconsistent with the vow which he had been living up to for the last 5 years? What sense would there be in putting himself in the way of temptation, when he knew perfectly well that she did not care a button for him? What use, indeed? And yet, as he said to himself, Christmas comes but once a year, and this was his party, and had not she herself stated that they were certainly old enough now to take care of themselves? Why shouldn't he sit next to her? He was no longer the sentimental, hot-headed boy of 5 years ago. They would enjoy themselves like any other sober bachelor and old maid. It would only be for one evening, and beginning with to-morrow he would stick to his vow as sturdily as ever. Yes, he would take in the eldest Miss Belknap, who would be the oldest woman present, and he would take Isabelle Hardy on his left. When he had made this important decision, Tom found the arrangement of his other guests a simple matter, and after one final scrutinizing but tolerably contented glance around the table, he walked into the ladies' drawing-room to await the arrival of his company. Punctually on the stroke of 7, the 3 Misses Belknap swept into the room in a merry flutter. They were tall beanpoles of girls, who had naturally a prancing style, and they were in their very best bib and tucker, which included great puffed sleeves and nodding plumes in their hair. In one breath they told Tom that they had considered it a grand idea, that they had been practically nowhere for years, and that it was a real pleasure to be thought of and taken down from the shelf, if only for a single evening. It was evident that they had come determined to have at least a good time, if not a riot, for when their eyes rested on George Hapgood, standing in the doorway, the picture of blank amazement, all 3 giggled convulsively as though they were 18. "Come in, George. Don't be afraid," said Tom. "They won't bite." "We really won't hurt you, Mr. Hapgood," said Miss Madeline, the eldest. "Do come in." It was too late for the woman-hater to draw back now, so, like the man he was, he braced his muscles and faced the music. He bowed with grave courtesy to the youngest Miss Belknap. He bowed with a faint smile, just a ghostly glimmer, but nevertheless a smile, to Miss Arabella, the second Miss Belknap. And when he faced the eldest Miss Belknap, who happened to be the furthest away from him, was the last to be reached, his features broke down completely, and he positively laughed for the first time in 20 years. "Do shake hands, Mr. Hapgood," said Miss Madeline. "This is like old times." And now everybody began to arrive in a bunch in the midst of a general handshaking and chorus of merriment. The arrival of each old stager, masculine or feminine, was greeted with fresh exclamations of delight, and a spirit of contagious frivolity was rampant from the very start. Tom was already bubbling over with enjoyment, but his eyes were glued on the doorway. There she was at last, looking younger and prettier than he had ever seen her in his life, and dressed bewitchingly. An old maid? It was impossible. It was monstrous. "It was very good of you to come, Miss Hardy." "I am very much pleased to be here, Mr. Wiggin." Most conventional phraseology, and there was really no reason why Tom should keep repeating the words over to himself in a dazed sort of fashion until he was called to account by the opening of the doors. "Dinner is served, sir." Then, readjusting his faculties, Tom gave his arm to Miss Madeline Belknap, every Jack did the same to his appointed Jill, and the company filed gaily into the dining room. Beginning with the oysters, there was almost a pandemonium of conversation, and tongues wagged fast and eagerly. There were to be no speeches. Tom had determined on that, or rather only a single one, and this was an afterthought. When the champagne was passed and all the glasses were filled, Tom rose in his seat. Everyone stopped talking, and there was an expectant hush. "I wish to offer a toast," he said, "a toast for the old bachelors to drink. Wish you Merry Christmas, and here's to her." There was a brief pause, and then George Hapgood, and in his wake the whole table, rose like one man and emptied their brimming glasses. "Here's to her." Tom did not look to right nor to left, not even out of the corner of his eye, as he drained to the last drop the sparkling wine. He would keep to his vow and drink to her in secret. Some of the ladies giggled slightly, and all looked at their plates. It was just a little awkward, even for the most unattached, until Miss Madeline Belknap rose, glass in hand, and said valiantly, with a wave of her napkin, "My dears, I give you a toast for you to drink. Wish you Merry Christmas. We are old enough to take care of ourselves. And here's to him." Then there was a babble. The women stood up to a woman, and the toast was consummated. Miss Hardy laughed gaily with the rest. Presently she turned to Tom and said, as if it had suddenly occurred to her, though they had been sitting side by side talking commonplaces ever since dinner began, "I have not really seen you for years, Mr. Wiggin." "Oh, I have been busy, very busy," said Tom, in a tone which, though he did not intend it to be so, was almost brusque. "So I have heard. I understand you have been very successful in your business." "I have stuck to it, that's all." "I really don't think we have met so as to talk together since Mrs. Carter's ball, and that was, let me see, 5 years ago this coming New Year's Eve. I remember we danced the German together, and you sent me some flowers which I didn't carry. Perhaps you have forgotten all about it, for 5 years is a long time, and you have been so busy. But I should like to explain to you about those flowers, why I didn't carry them. We are both old enough now to take care of ourselves, so there can't be any objection to my telling you, and you won't be offended at this late date, I'm sure. I had several bouquets that night, and Fanny Perkins, who was staying with me, had none. Fanny was shy and sensitive, and it occurred to me to offer one of mine to her. She wouldn't think of it at first, but Mother urged her so strongly that she gave in at last. 'Which shall I take, Isabel?' she asked. I thought a moment and then said, 'Take your pick, Fanny.' And she chose yours. And that is why I didn't carry it to the party. But I think you have forgotten all about it, Mr. Wiggin." Tom looked as though he had. His chin rested on his collar, and he seemed to be staring at the tablecloth. "I remember it as if it were yesterday," he said sadly. "I was a fool." Miss Hardy colored. "We were both young," she answered. "But now that we are older and wiser, I don't mind admitting on my side that it was stupid of me, to begin with, to give one of my bouquets to anybody, and stupid when I saw that you were put out not to tell you the truth. But wisdom is the reward of years, isn't it?" She talked easily, almost gaily. Tom suddenly realized that he had made a piece of bread, which he had been clutching, into a sodden ball. "I'd like to ask you a single question." He was trying to talk easily, too. "Why did you let Miss Perkins have her pick? Did you value them all equally?" "It was because I did not value them all equally that I told her to choose. I did not wish her to think that I cared for one more than the others." "And whose was that?" 5 years is a long time, Mr. Wiggin. You said a single question, and this is two. Alas, it is the only point in the story which I have quite forgotten." "Then why did you tell me?" "Because I hoped that we might be friends again. When people get to be as old as you and I, we value our old friends. There are none exactly like them." "And that is all?" "What more is there, Mr. Wiggin, except to thank you for your lovely book, and to wish you a Merry Christmas." "The carriages are waiting," said a servant in Tom's ear. The dinner was over, and it was time to set out for Albion Hall. The ladies filed into the drawing-room in order, as Miss Madeline phrased it, to give the old bachelors a chance for a short cigar. When that was over, Tom bundled his company into carriages, and away they all went in the gayest of spirits. Whatever belonging to the greenhouse had not been spread over the dinner table adorned the walls of the dancing-room, and presently as joyous and hilarious a company as any one would wish to see was tripping to the rhythm of the waltz over a perfect floor. There was just the right number for delightful dancing, no young, inexperienced couples to bump into everybody, no things-in-law to stand in the way and look stupid. No one but genuine old stagers taken down from the shelf for one last glorious frolic. You should have seen George Hapgood spinning round with Miss Madeline. How Fraser Bell grinned as he whirled Miss Mamie Scott from one corner of the hall to the other. And Tom? Where was Tom? As some of you who have danced at Albion Hall may remember, there is a very small bower-like anteroom, or offshoot, or whatever you choose to call it, a sort of adjunct to the supper-room, fit for just one couple to withdraw to. On this Christmas evening it was a veritable hiding-place, for the entrance to it was screened by two noble evergreens which stood as sentinels to demand a password. If the gay company suspected that Tom Wiggin was there, no one was rash enough to peep within and ascertain. Tom Wiggin was there, and quite contrary to the spirit of the occasion, he was down on his knees unbosoming the love which he had been smothering for 5 years to the girl of his heart. Only think of it! And he a bald-headed old bachelor, and she an old maid, old enough to take care of herself. There she sat with her hands before her and a smile on her face, letting him go on. And then, strangest part of all, when he had finished and told how miserable he had been while he was so very busy and absorbed in his business, she suddenly remembered whose bouquet it was she had valued most 5 years before, although she had declared an hour earlier that she had totally forgotten. And then but the rest is a secret known only to the sentinel evergreens and themselves. That is, the rest save one thing. It was after they had agreed to live as bachelor and maid no longer, and Tom was sitting looking at Isabel as if he had had no dinner, he remarked with a sudden outburst as though he were angry with destiny and a much outraged being, "Why on earth did I not find out 5 years ago that you loved me?" "Because," said the pretty spinster in question, "you never asked me, Tom dear." Tom Wiggin looked a trifle sheepish in spite of his joy. "I never thought of that," he said. "I am afraid I never did." End of The Bachelor's Christmas, by Robert Grant.
Number 4 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 4, A Christmas Journey in 1319. In the Record Office in London are preserved some money accounts concerned with the visit of the scholars of King's Hall to York at Christmas in the year 13 Edward II, that is, 1319. The following analysis gives the route followed by one section of the party and the expenses of the journey. It is a valuable record of the method and cost of travelling in medieval times. By way of preamble, I may say that the origin of King's Hall is to be found in the establishment at Cambridge in 1370 by Edward II of a body of scholars, or king's children, that they were regarded as part of the royal household, and that the nominations to the office of warden and to scholarships were reserved to the king. King's Hall was dissolved in 1546, and its buildings and property assigned by Henry VIII to Trinity College. Early in December 1319 the warden and scholars were ordered to spend the coming Christmas with the court then at York, and the Sheriff of Cambridgeshire was directed to provide for their journey. During the preceding Michaelmas term 33 members of the House had been in residence, and all of them went to York. The names of the members of the House in 1319 are immaterial to our story, but I venture to give them, for these students lived here nearly 6 centuries ago, and doubtless had hopes, plans, and ambitions at bottom much the same as we have. They were, in order of seniority: John de Bagshot, the warden; Nicholas de Durmford; Nicholas de Rome; David de Winchester; William Poor; Richard Poor; Nicholas Poor; John de Aston; John de Torterold; James de Torterold; Robert de Emmenworth; Thomas de Windsor; Walter de Nottingham; Roger Parker; John de Kelsey; John de Hull; Edward de Kingston; Hugh de Sutton; Philip de London; John de Salisbury; Richard de Salisbury; Robert de Beverley; John Fort; Ralph de Gretford; Henry de Gretford; Nicholas Parker; Nicholas Poole; Richard de Berwick; Andrew Ruskin; Thomas Griffin; John Griffin; William Dragsford; and John de Woodstock. It will be noticed that some of the students are designated by surnames which were already coming into use, and some by place names. The latter show from what a wide area the scholars were drawn. For the purpose of travelling, the society was divided into two sections, both of which started from Cambridge on Thursday, 20 December. One party, comprising the warden, John de Bagshot, and 6 of the scholars, went on horseback and arrived at York on Christmas Eve. Their journey thus occupied 5 days, and they covered about 35 miles a day. Of it we have no particulars, save that the warden paid £1 3s. 4d. for the hire in Cambridge of 7 hackneys, and was allowed £1 9s. 2d. for the other expenses, namely 10d. a day for each member of the party. The remaining 26 scholars travelled under the care of one of their number, John de Aston, and arrived at York on 28 December. They took with them 7½ lengths of cloth, with the furs thereto belonging, and 4 grooms; but whether the grooms went the whole way is not clear. It is with this 9 days' journey that I here deal. The cloth and furs which had been purchased on behalf of the Crown from merchants at Bury were valuable. The former was red in colour (de bleudes mixto), and had cost £21 2s. 6d. The latter comprised 21 lambskins, bought for £2 19s. 6d., and 6 budge skins, bought for £1. The carriage of these goods must have been a serious hindrance to rapid travelling. The first 2 days, Thursday and Friday, 20 and 21 December, were occupied in the journey from Cambridge to Spalding. This was made in 2 hired boats, with the services of 6 men, for which the charge was 5s. On 20 December the travellers paid 2d. for porterage of their goods to the boats at Cambridge, 1s. 7d. for bread, 2s. for beer, 1s. for herring, 1s. 4d. for hard fish and codlings, and 4d. for fuel. On 21 December they paid 1s. 5d. for bread, 2s. 2d. for beer, 1s. 7d. for herrings and other fish, 3d. for cheese, 2d. for porterage from the boats at Spalding, 5½d. for fuel and candles, and 8d. for beds at Spalding. On Saturday, 22 December, they travelled to Boston. On this day they paid 2s. for hiring 2 carts for carrying the cloth and 14 of the scholars, and 3s. for 12 hackneys for the rest of the party. They also spent 1s. 4d. for bread, 1s. 11d. for beer, 2s. 3d. for herrings and other fish, 5d. for fuel and candles, and 8d. for beds at Boston. The next 2 days, Sunday and Monday, 23 and 24 December, were occupied in the journey to Lincoln, which was performed in a single large boat. On 23 December they paid 5s. for the hire of this boat, 4d. for straw to spread on it, 2d. for porterage to the boat, 1s. 6d. for bread, 2s. 7d. for beer, 2s. 4d. for meat, 1s. 6 3/4d. for 8 hens, and 6d. for fuel. On 24 December they paid 1s. 2d. for bread, 2s. for beer, 2s. 1d. for herrings and other fish, 9d. for eels, 3d. for porterage from the boat at Lincoln, 6½d. for fuel and candles, and 8d. for beds at Lincoln. Tuesday, being Christmas Day, was spent quietly at Lincoln. Their expenses for the day were 1 shilling 4d. for bread, 2 shillings 1d. for beer, 2 shillings 3d. for meat, 1 shilling 1 1/4d. for 5 hens, 7 1/4d. for candles and fuel, and 8d. for beds. On Wednesday, 26 December, the party travelled to Torksey, making the journey in 2 boats hired at Lincoln. On this day they paid 2 shillings 8d. for the hire of the boats, 3d. for porterage to the boats, 1 shilling 8d. for bread, 2 shillings 3d. for beer, 2 shillings 1d. for meat, 7d. for eggs, 4d. for fuel and candles, and 8d. for beds at Torksey. The next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, 27 and 28 December, were occupied in the journey from Torksey to York, which was made in a large boat hired at Torksey. On 27 December they paid 6 shillings for the hire of this boat, 2d. for porterage to the boat at Torksey, 1 shilling 7d. for bread, 2 shillings 6d. for beer, 1 shilling 10d. for meat. On 28 December they paid 1 shilling for bread, 1 shilling 5d. for beer, 1 shilling 4d. for herrings and other fish, and 2d. for porterage of their goods at York. The total cost of the journey came to £4 5 shillings 8 1/2d., and this was repaid to the Warden from the Royal Exchequer on 31 December. On the opposite page is a summary of the daily expenditure described above. Reader's note. Here follows an extensive table of expenses. End note. There are no records of the expenses of the Society during the time the members were at York, but presumably while there they were treated as members of the royal household. Their visit, however, was not devoid of incident, since a warrant was issued against one of them, Robert de Beverley, for having joined with the prior of the Preaching Friars of Pontefract in an assault on a certain William Hardy. The student was left behind at York, and there disappears from our history. 2 other members of the house, Edward de Kingston and David de Winchester, were also left in the city, of whom probably at least one was concerned in this disturbance. 1 new member, Warren Trott, was admitted at York. These changes reduced the numbers to 31. Of these 31 members, 21, under the guidance of John de Aston, came back to Cambridge on the festival of St. Fabian and St. Sebastian, i.e. 20 January, while the Warden and the remaining 9 scholars, among whom Trott was included, arrived on 9 February, and from these dates their stipends in Cambridge during the Lent term, 1320, were reckoned. Why the King summoned the members of the house to York at so considerable cost I cannot say, but I think the detailed statement of how most of them travelled and their expenses on the journey are interesting. End of A Christmas Journey in 1319